Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad that you could join us today. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure that your microphones and web cameras are disabled. Oh, okay, I'm still on. Please make sure that your microphones and video cameras are disabled to provide a smooth webinar. During the webinar, if you have technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our upcoming webinars are the 30th of October. That'll be on a Wednesday with Sarah Stoddard. And then following that, on a Tuesday, we will have a webinar with Matthew Tyler. That'll be an introduction to Chinese genealogy. We do apologize for the schedule changes. However, these are the dates that worked best with these presenters. So if you aren't able to attend live, they will be updated shortly after. The previous webinars from the beginning of this month and the end of last month are going through production, and they will be posted shortly. We apologize for any inconvenience, and we'll let you know as soon as those are posted on our social media. So that's our Facebook and Twitter accounts, as well as they'll be uploaded on our YouTube page. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, you can visit our website or YouTube channel. All of those webinars have been recorded and they're updated the following Monday for your convenience. During this time, I am taking midterms, so there has been a bit of a delay on the most recent webinars, so I apologize for that. They will get uploaded shortly. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from James Tanner. We'll be giving a presentation on an update on the rules of genealogy. James Tanner has over 32 years experience in the genealogical research field and is an avid blogger of Genealogy's Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He has presented at expos and conferences around the US and Canada. He's served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. If you'll give me just a moment, I will put James' presentation on and we can begin.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. We're here for another webinar from the BYU Family History Library in beautiful fall weather of Provo, Utah. Today we're going to talk about the rules of genealogy. The rules of genealogy are generalized statements of certain types of issues that arise regularly in the genealogical community and for those who are doing research and also those who are entering names into online family trees. So the rules of genealogy have been around for a while. I've written about them now for quite a few years, and I've added a few, and we're up to 12. And there are 12 rules of genealogy. Here they are real quick. Read them all. Okay, you got them? Okay, we're moving on. No, don't worry. I'm going to comment on each one of the rules and we'll go through it in detail. So here's all the 12 of them together. And now we're going to move into rule number 1, which is when the baby was born, the mother was there. This is obviously the most famous of all of the rules and the one that's the most cited. How did this come about? Well, it came about because of a very interesting problem that occurs in genealogy. I can give a good example of that. My great-grandfather lived in a little tiny town on the Colorado Plateau called Joseph City, Arizona. Originally it was called Allen's Camp, and then it went through a couple of name changes. And interestingly enough, while his genealogy is online and pretty prominent, there are people who have added children to the family who were born in England. Now that might seem reasonable if they matched and fit into a slot or whatever, except for the fact that neither Henry nor his wife, Eliza, nor his second wife, Emma ever left Joseph City, Arizona. Actually, they traveled as far as Utah, which is the next state up from Arizona. So this is, this was basically an impossible situation. But what the rule generalizes that concept that people have to recognize that events in people's lives occur in specific locations. When a baby is born, the baby is born in a specific location, and the mother is always there. Yes. The father may not be there. The father may be wherever. He could be traveling. He could be on the other side of the world. But the baby is always there with the mother. And the importance of that is that you cannot separate those two events. In other words, people whom I'm talking to on occasion who will show me a entry in their pedigree, and it shows the mother located in New York State and the baby being born in Oklahoma. And we go, well, how did the mother get to Oklahoma to have the baby and then get back to New York State? This occurs most frequently, however, in places that are unfamiliar to the people who are entering the data into the trees. So for example, most people in the United States, I would venture to say virtually everyone in the United States, has only the vaguest idea of the location of the counties in England. So if I tell you my family came from Lancashire and your family came from London or from Kent, how far would it be from Kent to Lancashire? Now that's kind of a very simply solved question, because you can go to a map and see, go to Google Maps, for example, and see how far apart they are. But if you're telling me that a family had babies and the mother had babies back in the 1700s in Lancashire and also had them in Kent, you probably don't have the right family. And because how would the mothers have traveled that far distance? It's quite a ways. In between babies, or even when they were expecting a baby. Now, theoretically, I suppose it's possible, but the further back you go in time, the less possible it becomes. And in this case, what we have to understand is that the origin of this rule is almost universal ignorance of history and geography, or the lack of application of what knowledge they have by the practitioners of genealogy. And this isn't their fault. We're not faulting people for this. What we're saying is this is the reality of our lives here in the United States. This is primarily a US issue because they do not teach the subjects of history and geography any longer in the schools. And those people who actually took a geography class or a history class probably took that class many, many years ago, especially if they're in their advanced age like I am in having gone to school many, many years ago. So this is just an interesting thing, but the rule is here to remind everyone to make the connections, make sure that the geographic locations of the events in your ancestors' lives are consistent with the distances that the people would have had to travel. This, of course, there are exceptions, and there are people who travel great distances to migrate, but it's not likely. And on the most of the people in times past were born and then lived their lives and married and died within an area, very small radius. And the number usually given and supported by some very extensive studies is about 6 miles. So when you get outside of a 6-mile bubble around the individuals who are on your family tree, you have to begin to make sure that the information you're getting is well supported by documents and not just an issue of having chosen someone because it looked like they may be a child in that family. And so this is really kind of the summary. If you were to put the rule one into another, into different words, you would say children from the same family that were born in unlikely places. So that's kind of the basis of when the baby was born, the mother was there. So always check those places. You know, the simplest way to do that, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to look both places up in Google Maps. Put in the place you're going, just like you were going to travel from Kent to Lancashire, and you put Kent in, and then you put Lancashire in, and you'll see here that it's about 276 miles from middle of Kent to the middle of Lancashire. And that would have been a journey of back in the early 1800s, before 1830, when railroads began to be developed. That would have taken weeks to do that. It could have taken you 2 or 3 weeks. And then you still had to find places to stay on the way and how to feed yourselves and all that kind of things. And so it was kind of a difficult job. Okay, so that was the first rule, the great rule that when the baby was born, the mother was there. Now, rule 2 is a little more complex. And this one came up as a result of some interesting problems that occur with genealogists who are researching records. And this rule says absence of an obituary or death record does not mean the person is still alive. This kind of this creates a mindset of how we are approaching our genealogical research. And the reason this is a concerned rule is because this rule addresses the issue of people who become obsessed with finding one record. And unfortunately, I get a lot of contact with people who come and ask me questions and say things such as, I've been searching forever to find the rule. So here's a hypothetical conversation that might go on between me and a patron here in the BYU Family History Library, or at a random place at a conference, or another library or archive, or wherever I happen to be at the time. And the first one, I say to the person, how is your research going these days? Okay, well, this is kind of a very neutral opener for asking people if they need any help. And then the person responds, I'm looking for a death record. You can put in whatever record you want, because there's a blank there for records. For my great-great-grandfather, could be anybody. And I have been searching for that record for the past, fill in the years, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years, without success. Okay, I mean, I could say this. I have been actually looking for records for 30 years, and I haven't found them. So, you know, it's fine. And I say, do you think he's still alive? And the answer comes back, oh, of course not. He's not alive. And my answer back is, how do you know the person was alive? And then you get an interesting, well, we have a marriage record. We have children born in the family. We have all this information about the person. We just don't have a death record. Do we need a record to prove that they died? If this person was born more than 110 years ago, what are the chances that they're still alive? Why are we obsessed over finding a death record? Okay, well, you get the same thing. You can fill in any other kind of record here. You can put in marriage record. Why do we need a marriage record? These people lived together, they had children. Do we really need to find a marriage record? Okay, so these are questions and birth records. A person is found in the records and he died and he got married and he served in the army. He got born. So any of these records are not vital records, but you have to remember one thing. It's not an excuse for sloppy or incomplete research. You can't just cop out and say the record can't be found, like the courthouse burned down. When you're doing research, you need to have a holistic approach. No record the life is inconsequential. So yes, we would like to find the birth record. We'd like to find the marriage record. We'd like to find the death record. We'd like to find the employment record. We'd like to find the church records, etc. All of the records that we possibly can find about a person and a person's family. But we don't obsess about any one of those which may have been lost or may have never been created. And so this is really the rule that reminds us that we don't, that we need to be more realistic and not so obsessive with our research in genealogy as we go along. Okay, we're up to rule 3. Every person who ever lived has a unique birth order and a unique set of biological parents. Why is this rule here? This rule has to deal with some very varied ways that people are living in families. It applies to adoptions, foster children, guardianship, stepchildren, and any other type of relationship. The question often rises, and it shows up in many online family trees, where you have multiple parents of the same child. So I did this within the last day or two. I pulled up a name in the FamilySearch.org family tree, and there were 2 or 3 sets of parents. And today my wife was doing that, and she found someone with a husband who had been married 7 times, supposedly. There were 7 different marriages listed for him. So this is the question, is who are the unique biological parents? And even though there may be an adoption of foster child relationship, guardianship relationships, and step relationships, all of which can be recorded and are validly recorded in a genealogical pedigree. And there are other types of relationships in other cultures that we can't easily record. We still need to recognize that there's a unique birth order and a unique set of biological parents. Why does that? Because in order for us to realistically view and track the families, we need to have a concept of a consistent pattern. Even though cultures change, even though what the people are called in the different cultures change, and even in some cultures, as I just alluded to, the father in the family may not be the biological father. He may be the person who accepts responsibility for and provides for the child, independent of the biological origin of the child. However, we have to have this. Why? Because it's kind of the touchstone of genealogy, that it gives us a commonality that sorts out all of these various relationships across the world. Now, we get back to the second rule, and the second rule is not obsessing about a particular record, or in this case, we're going to extend it slightly, or relationship. If we have an adoption and for some reason, well, usually if you had an adoption that occurred back in the back before around 1862 in the United States, or earlier in some parts of Europe, there were no records of adoptions. It was not a formal legal occurrence. Parents who adopted a child simply did it. The child just came and lived, and they were considered to be a child in the family, and they were recorded as a child, but they were adopted. They came from a different family. And I find that with one of my family lines in Denmark, when we have an adoption that took many, 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 many years for us to discover and to document. But on the other hand, if we don't recognize the fact that there are always a set of biological parents, then we really have no kind of ground rule for establishing the relationship between individuals. This is becoming more in front of everybody out there in the world today because of all the DNA testing that's going on. The more we have DNA testing, the more we're becoming aware that these other types of child-parent relationships are essentially going to disappear once they get DNA tests and we start working through the relationships that occur. And many biologically related families are being recognized through the DNA testing and the family tree organization, online organizations that are matching up people to their bloodline siblings and parents. So the important thing about this is that it's also a reminder to use all the tools that we have available, not to ignore things simply out of expediency or out of laziness or out of whatever reason we might have. We need to remember that there are all of these tools out there, from doing on-paper research, from sitting in archives, to going and doing DNA tests, to working through chromosome and centimorgan relationships and all this kind of thing. We all need to understand that with all of these tools should be used to analyze and establish the relationships within the families that we're doing. We're doing this not out of any obsessive reason, but because we would, as historians, one of the goals that we would like to have is to be as historically and factually accurate as we possibly can be. Okay, we're up to Rule 4. We're really making time. I better watch the time here because there are 12 and so we got to work through them. By the way, as an introduction to Rule 4 that says there are always more records, we have to recognize the fact that as you look through all 12 of these rules, you'll find out that some of them seem contradictory. It's just the nature of life that there are contradictions in life and that they work at different levels. And so sometimes, even though it appears on its face to be contradictory, it is not. But here is one that says there are always more records. Now, I'll get to this in a minute in more detail, but it's not really all the time that there are more records. It just means that people need to keep looking. This really is a brick wall question. This is the one where people say, I have been looking for, that always seems the phrase that I hear people preface their statements about this. One of the things about being a genealogical researcher, and one of the things about joining the greater genealogical community, is your obligation as a genealogist to sit there and not grimace when people begin to tell you about their family. In other words, part of the whole idea here of being in genealogy is to be able to sit there and avidly listen to someone tell you about their great grandfather and what happened and why he had 7 wives or something. You know, you've got to be able to sit there and go, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I would never have thought of that. You know, things like that. It's got to keep it going. But anyway, so we get brick wall questions. I do all the time. I've looked at a lot of them. My batting average at resolving brick walls is pretty miserable. I'd be fired out of the majors if I was batting at anything as low as I get in trying to break down these brick walls. But occasionally we actually do find it. And after years of working our way through, some things turn out not to be really brick walls. They just are areas where people haven't really done any genuine research. They just kind of thought about it, not really gone out and looked for things. But here in this case, what we're talking is that it's highly unlikely that any individual researcher will have the time and/or the resources to look through all the records that exist and may contain information about a particular individual. Now, the first thing you're going to think about when you think about this is that we're going to go back in time, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's a different rule, actually. But what it says here is that there's all sorts of kinds of records. I used to be, people would come to me and their statement would be, I've been looking for years and we have searched everywhere for records about this individual. And my comment used to be, oh, wow, how did you like the New York Public Library? And they would look at me and say, I wonder why they tell me to talk to this guy. I think he's a little nuts. But anyway, then they would say, what do you mean? And I would say, well, I mean, you told me you were searched everywhere, and New York Public Library has one of the larger collections of genealogical records and things and manuscripts and stuff in the entire country. So I assumed if you've searched everywhere, you'd gone to the library. And they go, of course not. And I say, well, then let's think about it for a minute. You haven't searched everywhere. There are probably some records that we could find that you haven't looked at. And there are probably categories of records that you've never looked at. And that's really what this rule is about. It's about the fact that it always seems that there are always more records to look at. I sometimes bring up categories of records and people say, well, where in the world would you go to find those? And my answer is that's exactly the issue here, folks. If you don't happen to know where these records are and you don't happen to know that they exist, then probably you haven't looked at them. And so this is kind of the case. So I can mention a lot of records, like for instance, insurance records and railroad records and cattle growers association records and co-op records and on and on and on. There's all sorts of very extensive record sets out there that do not show up on the radar of most of the genealogical websites. I have to give one example of a record that is very, very extensive. Throughout the United States, in many, many, many places, not uniformly, but very, very commonly, there are a set of records for cemeteries that have to do with certain parts of the process of burying a body in a cemetery. And some of these records include a permit for opening the grave. Now, who gives the permit? Usually a state or county record says you have the permit now to open the grave, permit to close the grave. In fact, there are records selling the burial plot to the person who has purchased it for the deceased, or the deceased who purchased the lot during his or her lifetime so that they would have a place to be buried. You go through the transaction of being buried in detail, and I mean exactly what happens when a person dies and ends up in the ground, and you will find out that there's a whole series of records. If you go online and you look in the larger family history database websites, you'll see probate records, you'll see death records. Everything in between is not there. They just have never collected those records. There's only one or two ever. And the two of the most prominent ones that you would think of, Family Search and Ancestry, have only like one or two records that talk about the permits for burial. Very common records. They're out there floating around in the world of records. They've never made it into the genealogical community. Very interesting issue. Okay, well, let's move on. Oh, this is the other part of this rule. The rules applies directly to burned counties, because the issue here is, answer this question. When you say all of the records of your family were destroyed in a fire in the courthouse, you tell me what records were in the courthouse when it was burned. You tell me exactly which records, what years were there, what records were there, and what records were not there. And the answer to that is, there were records that were not there that were not burned. And have you searched those records? Now they'll say, yes, we searched all those records. No, we're back to the same question. There's always more records. Okay. Number 5, you can't get blood out of a turnip. Now, if you search that phrase, it really goes back for quite a ways in English history that you can't get blood. It seems obvious. I mean, you just can't get blood out of a turnip. But what does this really mean for a genealogist? What it means is illustrious or famous ancestors are just that, ancestors. you don't get brownie points. You don't become great and famous just because you're related to somebody who is famous. And it's aimed at, my rule is aimed at debunking the concept that individual worth can be based on the identity of a person's ancestors. And it's been so many years that people have, all across the world, have built up their whole civilizations and their societies based on people, on where a person was born. And so far, I haven't seen any pattern in how different individuals were born, other than they're born. Just because, I mean, right now today we're having babies born probably as I speak by the hundreds of thousands across the world, and where they're born. And if they were born and their parents happen to be royalty, they're royalty. And if they're born and their parents happen to be natives living out in the Amazon jungle, their family is in the Amazon jungle. And there is no particular, the baby, it says baby's born, that doesn't mean anything about the baby's worth as an individual and as a person. Of course, this is kind of revolutionary. I think it goes back to all men are created equal and something about the Declaration of Independence and sort of stuff we have here in the United States. But, it's not the same all over. But the idea here is that just because you can trace your line back to royalty, you may think you have something, but you really don't, because all you've done is some work that goes back perhaps to a royalty. And I just kind of like to get on that. But there is a really, 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 really dark side to this. And that's the idea of eugenics. Not too many genealogists even recognize this word now. The word has become very unpopular because of the consequences. It was a movement that started back in the mid 1800s. And the idea here was that you could improve the stock of humanity by selective breeding of humans, like you would breed horses or dogs or, guppies or whatever. That you can somehow, that there was this goal of creating the model human being. And as you keep talking about this, you might, if you have some feel for history, begin to understand where this ended up. It ended up in killing people because of their ancestry. And the reason why eugenics is no longer a extremely hot topic, at least using the word eugenics is not a hot topic, is because the idea of a master race was pretty much made a horrible example of that through what happened in Germany with the Nazis prior to World War II. Unfortunately, this keeps coming back. It is still out there, and it's interesting that people kind of get into this mindset that if we just control the genetics of our population, we could erase all of these diseases and we would create a perfect race of people and so forth. This is kind of interesting because it implies that we do not help or support people who aren't part of the perfect ideal that we have. Now, we could go on for a long time because this is a topic that gets me a little bit upset. Okay, but we're going to go to Rule 6. And Rule 6 is probably the shortest one and one of the more complex to understand and to use. Rule 6 is records move. And I like to use Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania was very systematically settled from east to west. East Coast, obviously, on the east of Pennsylvania is New Jersey, but there's direct contact with the ocean. And the Pennsylvania began to be settled down in the southeast corner of the state around the area that we call Philadelphia, and began to and people began to move. Now, what happens is that as people move and as new jurisdictional entities, like counties, are created, that the records move around in the state. Now, 2 or 3 things can happen. The first one is that we have, let's pretend we have someone who is the new county person and someone who is the old county person. And a new county has been created. In this case, in the early days of Pennsylvania, a county like Lancaster down there on the southern border, or Bucks County or Berks County, were large enough to stretch all the way, almost all the way across the state. Of course, the west part of the state of now the state of Pennsylvania was just forest, was just full of trees mostly, all the way over to the Ohio River. So now what happens? Well, let's say they form a new county. And so the old county person's there, the new county person's there, and the new county person comes in and says, oh, we have a new county. And the old person says, yeah. And the new person says, what's going to happen to the records? I think we should have our records. And the old county guy says, nope, they're my records. You don't get them. You make your own records. So the new county guy goes off and makes his own records. So the people who now live in the new county, if they want the old records, for instance, when they purchased their property, where do they have to go? They have to go to the old county. Okay, new scenario. Old guy, new guy. New guy comes and says, oh, we got a new county. And the old guy says, yeah, and it's a great opportunity for me because you get all the records. I'm tired of them and you can take them all. Here you go. So the new guy gets all the records. Now, where do the people who live in the old county have to go to get their records? They have to go to the new county. Okay, third scenario. Old guy, new guy, same people. New guy comes up and says, oh, we're here. I got a new county. What are we going to do with the records? The old guy says, I'm really tired of having them. And the new guy says, well, I don't want them. And they said, well, let's ship them to the state. So they pack them all up and they ship them to the state. Okay, so then the next scenario, old guy, new guy. We got 4 scenarios here, folks. Old guy comes up, sitting there, new guy comes up. Oh, we got a new county. We got records. What do you want to do with the old records? Well, I don't have any space for them anymore. You've got to take them. Well, we don't have any space. We don't have a building yet. Well, okay, then let's just throw them away. So they throw them away or burn them or whatever. Okay, those are the 4 things that could happen with the records. Now, Pennsylvania is a good example because records were passed to the new counties, including the old records. And so in some instances, you may find records, it's possible, and I've heard about this, that you can find records that were created down in Bucks or Lancaster County or Montgomery or one of the counties, the early counties, all the way across in Washington County over there in the west side in Ohio. How many of you would have thought to look all the way across the state in another county for records? So this is what happens. The same thing happens with states as they were created. The same thing happens continually with towns and things that anytime. Because the records may, in fact, not be in either place, but may end up in the state archives or the state library and not in any of the counties. So we need to remember that because they move to the archives, the libraries, and the storage. That's more common than, almost as common as the records being either retained in the old county or being moved to the new county or to the state archives. All 3 of those can happen and do happen quite frequently. And I've run into that in the records that were retained in the county for over hundreds of years and records that moved almost immediately to the state. So it just depends. And so you really need to remember to look in all of the historic jurisdictions, any place where the records could have been, you need to know exactly where the records were created and then determine how many different jurisdictions had control of that spot during the time that your records may have been created. And then look for all of those places, all the adjoining counties, any place that it could possibly have been, where those records could have been kept. Well, now we're going to talk about Rule 7, which is water and genealogical information flow downhill. I could have left out the genealogical information part of this, but then it would have made almost no sense to anybody. So of course, water rolls downhill. But if I throw that genealogical information part in there, then you can see that there's something that I'm really trying to point out here with this rule. What this rule is aimed at, very simply, is entropy. And entropy is a principle that was introduced actually not that long ago. And the idea of entropy is related to some of the general rules of the way the universe functions, and it's very kind of an underlying principle of science. We sort of ignore it when we think about historical records in genealogy, but it applies because there is a entropy of information. And entropy is the lack of order or predictability that includes a gradual decline into disorder. So what happens to records over time? Well, they get scattered, which is the lack of order. They go to places where you would never think that they were being kept. That's the predictability issue. And they decline into disorder, meaning they generally end up being harder and harder to find and search. And they get separated into parts, and there's gaps, and there's difficulties, and there's problems. And these increase as we go back in time. Now, this was the rule that seems to be a contradiction to the rule that there are always more records. And this is where we have to split it up. We say, yeah, there are always more records, but all of the records that there are have a tendency to disintegrate and disappear over time. So even though there are always more of them, meaning you can always find a different kind of record than you were expecting, that doesn't mean that over time there won't be fewer and fewer of these records for you to search, and you'll be stuck with the difficulty of finding any records at all, not just a particular record, but anything that even approximates or talks about your ancestral family and the place where they lived. And where's the cutoff? Well, technically, we usually cut off records as we go back in time. And so as we look back in time, there are fewer and fewer records available to be searched. And so as we look at all those records, you can't keep looking forever, but because we don't have forever in our lives, but those numbers of records seem to decrease. And in fact, they do decrease. There are always cutoff dates. Okay, so for example, we live here in Utah, in the United States, and when are the earliest European records that were maintained in the area that we now call Utah? Well, that's pretty simple to do. 1847. Why? Because that was when the first Europeans began settling in Utah. There were people who came here from Europe before that, explorers and mountain men and things like that, but they didn't keep any records. There were no particularly genealogically important or substantial records kept until after the main body of the Europeans arrived in 1847. In the United States, the area of the United States, we have certain very specific dates as to when any European contact began and when records began to be kept. In every other country, if you examine the records sets, you will find that there is an earliest date at which there are any extant records. That means records that are in existence. So this is kind of the idea here of this rule, is that the records basically are all going to disappear. We're up to number 8. Everything in genealogy is connected, and I put the term butterfly in parentheses because that kind of reminds us of what they call the butterfly effect. And the butterfly effect technically dealt with the concept of weather, that the flap of a butterfly's wings in one part of the world could create a hurricane in another part of the world. Actually, hurricanes are much more complex than that, and the flap of a few million butterflies still isn't going to create a hurricane if the circumstances for creating a hurricane don't exist. But it really is a good concept, because everything in historical records is generally connected, and this sort of symbol that looks like an infinity, it is an infinity because it's a way to plan, build, continuous integration, deploy, operation, and continuous feedback. This is really how you should be doing your genealogy. You should be constantly thinking in terms of the holistic. The term we use in genealogy that kind of applies to this area is called cluster research. We really should apply a different term, and I think that there isn't a really good term out there that I've thought of, but it's a way to express the fact that genealogical research is never finished. We never actually get through with it. And we also have to recognize what we call the 6 degrees of relationship, is that everybody in the world, this is kind of something that people say. And the question is it actually a true statement? And the answer is, yeah, they've demonstrated this lots of times, that everyone in the world is literally connected through a path of about 6 different people. So you can choose any person, if you want to just a random person in India or any other place in the world, China or Australia or Africa or South America or the United States, you can usually find that there are only 6 different people that know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows that person. And so that's kind of an interesting fact. Perhaps you'll go look up something now and disprove that and tell me it's really 10 people, but it's an interesting concept anyway. Rule 9, there are patterns everywhere. Now, one thing important, in my way of view, my personal worldview looks at everything as a pattern. Everything I look at is basically a relationship and pattern. I've been doing this all my life. I look at things and I see the pattern. I don't see individual items so much as I see a pattern of items, a way that things are set up or maintained. And what happens in genealogy is that everything in genealogy is a pattern. Every family in a family tree with its associated documents and information makes a pattern. Documents in an archive or library make patterns. History is full of patterns. Every time we think about it, there's all these interrelated events of history. No one person, there was the old poem about no man is an island. Well, the idea here is that everyone is interconnected. Everyone exists here on the earth. And even if you were living as far as you could from any civilization by yourself in a cave, you would still have an interaction with the rest of everyone on life, because you're still breathing air and using up and consuming resources and things. So everybody's really, and it's just kind of the basis for thinking about subjects like ecology and things like that. But there is an ecology of genealogy, and that is that all of this is related. So when you start thinking about patterns, then you start thinking about how does this person fit into the pattern of this family in this place at this time. And then that gives you a way to investigate the family that is from a different perspective than you would have if you were thinking about them as individuals with a name who were born and died in a certain place or whatever. So that's kind of an important one. Then we get to Rule 10, which is read the fine print. As an attorney, I was very much used to reading fine print. That's something that we did. The fine print is is that those provisions of contracts and documents that are in usually a reduced typeface type size down to, like 8-point or 6-point type. And in fact, you see them on, you can see the fine print on any consumer product today, especially in the United States. They have all these things you have to put on any kind of food product or whatever, tell you what's in it and how many calories you're eating and all that kind of stuff. Very discouraging, by the way. But the fine print is something that as an attorney you learn to look at. Except eventually you get to the point where you know what the fine print says, and unless you suspect or have some reason, you're certainly not going to spend a whole lot of time reading it, because you just don't. It's just, all the same stuff all the time. And it really just makes life really difficult if you sit there and read it all. But it would be a good idea if you understood it all. And if you haven't read it all, you're in bad shape, because you may agree to something that you didn't really agree to or want to agree to. And in genealogy, what we're talking about with fine print is everything in the documents that you ignore because you either don't understand it, or because you don't have time, or because you don't want to read it, or whatever thing else. And that may be where all the answers to your questions are. And that's the simplest way to put that. For instance, probate. Some probate files are hundreds of pages long. You need to read through every word on every page. There may be some information on any one page, or even written in the margin of the pages, that would be the answer to the mystery or the problem that you're searching. So there's just all sorts of things. And so reading the fine print is a reminder that we need to look at these documents in depth, go back and reread them until we understand them. And when we understand them, reread them until we appreciate all of the content, what's in that document, what's important. Rule 11. We're getting there, aren't we? We're getting close. We'll be through. Rule 11, even a perfect fit can be wrong. This is the same name issue. This is the issue that we run into almost as daily if you're doing research, is people basically assuming that their John Brown is the same John Brown that they find in the first document that they pick up. And so therefore, that's their John Brown. And even though that John Brown may have lived hundreds of miles from their original person, or may have died long before the person was, their spouse or children were born. This is not something that I don't run into on a regular basis. Within the last 2 days, I found a family that clearly every one of the children and the husband had all been born after the wife died. I mean, the wife was in there as dying before anybody in that other people in the family who were born. And so how possibly could that be the right person? And so even though her name was perfectly consistent with all of the names of everybody, either the date had to be wrong, it was the wrong person, or the name was wrong. Well, something was wrong about that person, because it just did not fit. But when you look at it, there is perfect fits that can be wrong. And the perfect fit, for example, I found a family the other day, 2 families where the husband and the wife had the same names. They were born in the same place. They had been born, if they were different, they had been born only 1 or 2 weeks apart or months apart. And they had a child by the same name. And the question was, is this one family, or is this 2 different families? And the more research I did, basically it turned out there actually were 2 different families that were that closely named. Now, this is not even going to be unusual in a place like Denmark or Sweden or Norway, because there's so few people with this, there's so many people with the same names. But it's also the same in Germany, and it's pretty much the same in England and in Spain and in Latin America and in the United States and in Japan and China and in, oh, by the way, it's kind of a universal problem. Yes, there are people with the same names everywhere, folks. I used to think my name was unique until I drove into Arlington National Cemetery and there was a tomb with James Tanner written on it. And I thought, I guess my name is not unique. Rule 12, the end is always there. Yeah, and even if you're on this dirt road, which by the way is on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, north of the Grand Canyon, and is about 63 miles of this dirt road, it does end. It ends at a 3,000-foot cliff on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. So getting there is all the fun. But here is the point. The point here is that as I examine pedigrees of the hundreds and thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of pedigrees that I've looked at, I have yet to find one where there wasn't an end on any particular line. In other words, the end is always there. There's always some end of the line. And it does not go back to Adam. There just is no connection. No person on the face of the earth today has a provable sourced genealogy that goes back past about 900 AD if you're in the Western European area, or some of the lines go back much further into 300, 400 BC in China and some of the countries out there. But at every instance, there is an end. There is a last ancestor in that line. And so, you know, if you've got this kind of thing in your pedigree, I've had a standing challenge to everyone. Anyone who wants to bring me a pedigree, I can look at it in a very short order, within less than an hour usually. I can find the end of any pedigree and tell you this is where the end is. There's no basis from going back another generation because there are no documents and there is no way that you can prove that this is the right person that's the child in this family. So this is kind of the end of the process, because if we realize that every family tree and every line has an ending point, then going back yet another generation may not be possible. In other words, we talk about brick walls. In fact, they may be end of lines. There may not be any records that go further back, even though my rule says there are always more records that, like I said, there are different ways of looking at what we're doing here. There's always more records for those people who are searching for records when there are more records, but there are not always more records when you start going further and further and further back in time. There always is an ending point back there someplace. Now, here's the last question, and that why do we have rules? And why do we have these rules for genealogy? Well, my concept is to put in a very short phrase a set of rules that would help people understand that there are some very realistic parameters in which we operate with genealogical research. We need to remember that this is historical research. It's based on documents, and that if we don't have a documentary source for supporting a conclusion that we've made, we shouldn't be making that conclusion. We can guess, but we need to be clear that we are guessing and not simply set down ancestors off into the stratosphere based on copying. One of the other rules, which I haven't ever written down, and it's not really doesn't belong in this set at all, is that you stop doing genealogical research the minute you start copying a pedigree out of a book. So once you think that you've gotten a pedigree from England or from Europe or someplace or wherever it is, and you're just copying it down and copying it down, you're probably not doing genealogical research at all. You're copying, and you're not relying on any evaluation of the consistency or truth of what's being written. You're simply copying, and that is not genealogical research. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Appreciate your being in these, attending these webinars. This And all the webinars will be put online on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, as Maren mentioned at the beginning, and that we will get those up as soon as we can, given our circumstances here in the academic world. Also, remember that we have a BYU Family History Library website that's part of the Brigham Young University website, and that BYU website has the schedules and additional copies of the webinars, links to a different copy of the webinar series. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.
All right, we apologize that there isn't any time for questions. If you have questions, you're welcome to email fhl_webinars@byu.edu, and then I can go ahead and send that email to James and he can answer that. Our next webinar will be on the 30th. That will be a Wednesday at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. That'll be with Sarah Stoddard, and she'll be presenting another webinar on DNA. Following Sarah's webinar on Tuesday, the 5th of November, we'll be having an introduction to Chinese genealogy webinar with Matthew Tyler. So that'll be on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you would like to view a recording, a previous recording of any of our webinars, like James said, they are on our YouTube channel and on our website. And the previous couple webinars from last month, as well as the beginning of this month, will be uploaded shortly. If you have any comments or questions about that, you're welcome to email again at that email, fhl_webinars@byu.edu. Thank you so much, and we hope that you have a wonderful weekend.